Okay, let's move forward to this law and political economy and institutions roundtable. This panel will have Professor Anna Chadwick, who is lecturer in international law and legal theory at the University of Glasgow. Her monograph, Law and Political Economy of Hunger, was published in 2019. At Glasgow, Professor Anna convenes an interdisciplinary LLM course, Law and Markets, which explores how economists and lawyers think about law in the operations of market economy. The other member of this panel is my former colleague, Jed Kronk. Jed is an associate professor of law at the University of Hong Kong. His work focuses on historical and comparative approaches to issues of law and political economy and international development, with a focus on alternative labor and property institutions. He's especially interested in expanding critical approaches to the intersection of legal and economic regulation in Asia. And finally, Professor Diogo Coutinho, who is a professor at the University of São Paulo. Professor Coutinho holds a master in law from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and a doctorate from the University of São Paulo Faculty of Law. He was a visiting professor at the Center for International Legal Studies, CTLS, and a research fellow at SEBRAP, Brazilian Center for Analysis and Planning. At IGLP, the Institute for Global Law and Policy. He has written on law and development, administrative and economic law, and regulatory policies in Brazil. He co-edited, among others, the volume Law and New Developmental States, the Brazilian Experience in Latin American Context, published by Cambridge University Press. So, we'd like to come. Okay.
Yeah, me first, okay.
Professor Chadwick.
Thank you.
Sorry. You have 15 to 20 minutes.
Okay, I think I'm around 18 minutes, so just to give you a heads up. Hi everyone, thanks very much to the organisers for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. So the title of my talk today is Locating the Law and Political Economy Movement, and what I propose to do, as you may have seen from the abstract that was circulated, is to give a kind of overview of what I and others are claiming is a new movement in legal scholarship, and to offer some thoughts about how, through a law and political economy lens, we might see institutional debates and questions of economic development differently. So what I'll first do is nod to some of the sources that have acknowledged this turn to law and political economy and are seeking to position it as a movement. Then I'll try and give a definition of the law and political economy movement and try and think about how it might be differentiated from other legal movements that have come before that share some of the same features, and also some contemporary movements that are engaged in similar debates. Next, I'll reflect briefly on what has caused this turn to political economy and legal scholarship. And then I'll offer some reflections on what a particular focus on law can bring to institutional political economy and institutional thinking. If I get time, I'll have a little reflection on what a political economy perspective can also do for law. And then I'll come to think about what I see as being the meta question that the law and political economy movement is thinking about or working towards the resolution of, perhaps. Okay, so in terms of the people who have signalled that there's been a shift in legal scholarship that might amount to a new movement, we have the celebrated international legal theorist David Kennedy, who in 2013 wrote an article in which he was suggesting that globalization has changed the coordinates for legal scholarship, and that more and more scholars are now engaging with and recognizing that the elements of economic life, capital, labor, credit, money, etc., are actually creatures of law, and that the same can be said of elements of political life, power and right. We also have a new, relatively new development in terms of the law and political economy blog, which some of you may be signed up to, and which is run out of the US, I think the scholars at Yale and Harvard, who again are proposing a new departure, a new orientation to legal scholarship that looks at this interrelationship between law and economy and how law constitutes particular political visions of the economy and the operations of markets. And you can see some of their concerns and what's animating their thinking there on the slide. And now, often when we see the emergence of a new movement, maybe we can see it as being as such when there is efforts to define it and critique it going on. So here we have a couple of articles by scholars in the UK who've picked up on this turn to political economy and have sought to try and do some of this work of identifying what it's about. And Haskell and Rasoloff have evinced some skepticism of the coherence of the term. So we're already seeing attempts to critique it. And what they suggest is that maybe what's going on is not necessarily a turn to a concrete field, and that in some ways the concept of political economy to which lawyers are turning is quite nebulous, and that maybe political economy is just being used as a buzzword. And so they say that I think what you're going to find is that most of them, international lawyers, think that political economy simply stands for some vague idea that economic structures and political power are fused together. Now, I should highlight that Haskell and Rasoloff are actually supportive of the turn to political economy. I think what they want is for international lawyers to do political economy better. And this kind of reflects the similar debates that we've seen with history, when lawyers purport to do history and those kind of debates about the rigor of the methodology, etc. So they are supportive of the move in general. So on this slide, I've tried to think about the different antecedents to the law and political economy movement and to some of the contemporary movements that share some of the same preoccupations. Now, those in the antecedents box, the orange box, I think, there are a number of movements in which definitely there have been seminal texts in each movement that I think we can say exhibit many of the same methodological characteristics and same preoccupations as the law and political economy movement. Those may be more familiar to the legal scholars among you. Some of those movements are more familiar to the legal scholars among you than those who are not lawyers. But I think we can say, obviously, classical political economy has been an influence, aspects of legal realism, old institutional economics, some of the Frankfurt theorists, German ordo-liberal thinking, and then thinking on neoliberalism that has looked at those relationships between ordo-liberal thinking and neoliberalism. Critical legal studies and its surviving cousin, social legal studies. But I think it's also very important to point out that while scholars in the global north, so the scholarship that I mentioned before, and the law and political economy blog, etc., is in some ways positioning this as a new movement. In many ways, the intellectual coordinates of the law and political economy movement have been set, I think, by work that has been going on in the global south for a very long time. So in the green box there, we have the trends in legal scholarship that have been thinking about how law constitutes particular political economic dynamics and thinks about law in a systemic and relational way. And I think that in many ways, the law and political economy scholarship that we're seeing now owes a lot to this earlier movement. And finally, on the point of contemporaries, we do have these other movements, so the legal origin scholarship that is looking at, in some ways, how this civil law or common law origins may lead to greater economic growth or development, and those debates. The varieties of capitalism school that look in detail about how different institutional configurations of capitalism may produce different results in terms of patterns of economic development and perhaps tendencies towards welfare, protections, etc. for society. And also the legal institutionalism school share very much with law and political economy. And I think that legal institutionalism in particular is very difficult to differentiate neatly from this law and political economy movement, and perhaps the two are part of the same trend. Nevertheless, I do think that there is something novel and important about this turn to political economy that hasn't been captured in those earlier bodies of scholarship. So here I'm attempting to give a bit of a definition of what the difference is and what's new. So I've defined the LP movement as a post-2008 interdisciplinary intra-legal movement that is concerned with identifying the legal infrastructure of the contemporary market economy and analysing its functions. I think that scholars in this movement depart from an understanding that economic, political and legal systems are co-constitutive, as opposed to trying to prove that interrelationship, which is I think what some of the legal realist scholarship and perhaps scholarship in critical legal studies was maybe concerned to do. I think that LPE stands apart from other legal scholarship on the economy, notably law and economics, by virtue of this skepticism about the positive and normative claims of economic theory. And then it's distinguished by other scholarship in political economy, which is also similarly skeptical of certain trends in economic theory, by this particular preoccupation with the role of law. Again, I think that LPE is applying insights that in many ways have been derived from scholarship principally developed to analyse the predicament of countries in the global south and how perhaps economies in the global north have had an impact on those countries through processes of colonialism or through neo-colonial regimes in international law, for example. And I think that what's going on here is that increasingly that kind of analytical lens is now being applied to the economies of the global north, whereas I think in a lot of the scholarship of some of the international law scholarship, like the third world approaches to international law, etc., was more concerned with the structure of the economies in the global south as an object of investigation, and in some ways didn't analyse in a deep way what was going on in the economies of the global north. So I think that's also novel. LPE scholarship, I would say, is also influenced clearly by writing on classical political economy and Marxist analysis. But in contrast with those traditions, I think it's more concerned about examining the existing institutional infrastructure and less concerned with the elaboration of theories on the question of where the real source of value lies. Whereas I think classical political economy was about developing theories of where value resides, for example, in land, in trade, in labour, etc. Whereas I think the law and political economy scholarship is largely agnostic to those debates in some ways, or is certainly not engaging with them very deeply yet. I also think LPE is quite uniquely intra-legal in terms of its focus, and is concerned with the connectedness of legal regimes and the sense of law as a system or even a meta-institution. And therefore it goes much beyond the kind of single area of law, single institution scholarship that has characterised a lot of previous writing. Unlike earlier traditions of critical scholarship, I also would suggest that the LPE movement is perhaps less convinced that critique is the end game of scholarly engagement. I don't know how many of you are familiar with critical legal studies, but I think that a defining feature of that movement is thought to be that in some ways proposing solutions can result in quite naive interpretations, and so there's a strong encouragement that the task of the scholar is very much to just rigorously engage with a critique of capitalism, or if that's the object of study, and think about the forms that it's taking, but perhaps not identifying solutions. Okay, so in terms of what's caused this turn, I won't linger on this, but I just want to highlight the critical significance of the global financial crisis, which is why I've given it that periodization of post-2008. Because I think really that there has been an irrevocable shift away from faith by policymakers, by a lot of economists, and maybe by a lot of lawyers and scholars in the capacities of financial calculus realised in financial instruments to manage risk, etc. And I think that deep crisis of faith that we've seen by people like Lord Adair Turner talking about the former chair of the Financial Services Authority in the UK, talking about really about this crisis of faith in economics and what to do about it. And I don't think that solutions have been very forthcoming yet, but I think that has conditioned a shift away from a faith in a certain way of thinking about how markets work, and much more interest in the political and social stakes, so who pays the bill when it all goes wrong. And I won't talk too much about all of these, but there's been some groundbreaking scholarship. In particular, we might think of Piketty, that has again sort of set the coordinates for this type of investigation. And the latter two, I think, are linked. So I think, again, maybe there's a sense of a frustration with the limits of critique as a tool of social change, and a feeling that in some ways those who are maybe more inclined to more on the left, that there's perhaps a focus on critique has given away the field to others who have been elaborating theories of how markets work and what we should do, whereas the left has maybe been constrained in this critical role that has meant that some sort of vacuum has been left, which has led to the rise of certain problematic trends in populism, etc. Okay, so in terms of what this focus on law can bring to political economy, it's important to point out that political economy, institutional political economy in particular, has done a very important service in terms of already elaborating important roles that the law plays in the operations of the market. So some of you may recognize this formulation from Ha-Jin Chang, and talking about how law plays these different roles of defining who can participate, what the legitimate objects of exchange are, what the rights and obligations of different agents are, and how law regulates the exchange process. So critical and important work has already been done there. However, law is not typically singled out as a special subcategory of institution in institutional political economy. So as Tamara Lothian has noted in her book, Law and the Wealth of Nations, in the Economist version, the market is a market, property is property, and a contract is a contract. And of course, she's there talking about quite a narrow vision of economic theory, but she's saying that 150 years of political economy should have banished those beliefs, but somehow they still survive in some way. And I think what we can say, and now I'm moving on to list a few examples of what the particular focus on law can bring, is that I think Lothian's quote is perhaps a bit too, doesn't do enough service to new streams in economic thinking that very much have questioned more what a contract is, etc. But I do think it's true to say that existing institutional approaches do tend sometimes to essentialize the law and to not look deeply enough into the inconsistencies and controversies and tensions within legal regimes. So I think lawyers can bring something to the debate in terms of thinking that, for example, property in a share is very different from property in a piece of land. In fact, its legal administration is very different. In fact, the rights and capacities that it grants to an actor within the market and how it enables them to influence what's going on in the market is very different. So I think that is an important thing that a particular focus on law can do. Another thing I think it can do is that institutional political economy has not typically grappled with the role of constitutions. And in some ways, I think some trends in institutional thinking create the impression of a sort of structure that can be taken apart piecemeal and readapted and changed to alter what we don't like about capitalism. Whereas I think, or the negative trends in capitalism. Whereas I think that what the legal perspective and this important critical role of constitutions with a big C points out is that it may not be possible to sort of neatly separate certain institutional forms without also unraveling a sense of social identity or the social fabric that constitutes a particular polity. And relatedly to this, I think that courts are not typically analysed deeply in institutional thinking, and there's something very particular about the precedent-based reasoning of lawyers that has a lot to say about the nature of path dependency. And that perhaps there's this interesting dynamic going on in which lawyers and judges are interpreting certain values, such as autonomy, freedom, etc., juridical equality, in ways that are in line with a different logic, in line with a different philosophical reasoning, but that carries with it a market-enabling twin. So I think that there's important dynamics going on in the way that where the Constitution is concerned, certain types of rights and entitlements are being elevated beyond democratic control and beyond the control of many institutions. And that's something that we also need to think deeply about and that lawyers can bring to the debate. However, I think that this is there's an interesting dynamic here, because as a lot of institutional scholarship has taught us, agents tend to become cognitively immersed in the fields in which they operate, in the institutions in which they operate. And I think there is something to say that lawyers and judges may be educated in thinking about certain bodies of law in ways that are very different to how economists would understand them and see their values very differently. And there could be some potential for, say, maverick judges, and owing to the open-textured and quite flexible and malleable characteristics of law that recent work has exposed, be prevailed upon in some ways to offer interesting interpretations of key legal rights and regimes. So I think that the law and political economy perspective, and particularly its intralegal focus, is so important because it shows that law is in some ways a kind of meta-institution, and maybe in some ways be further removed from the particularities of particular organisations or states, and it can therefore give us new perspectives on agency. So often in institutional thinking, there's a trend to sort of reveal the state as the agent behind certain developments in the market, etc., or certain operations of certain institutions. Whereas actually, I think this legal perspective shows us that in many ways, it is the state that is immersed in a particular institutional landscape that is, in other ways, constituted by law. So institutional thinking might be analysing the development state or the neoliberal state, but in some ways that state is acting in an institutional landscape that is very much preconditioned by a lot of legal developments that have come before. What am I saying here? So I think this may explain some of the, I guess I'm doing a bit of a critique of the varieties of capitalism school here, in terms of saying that actually when you zoom down hard, you see a lot of difference, but when you zoom up, you see these kind of systemic meta effects, and I think perhaps law has a lot to do with that. And I think Katerina Pista's new book, which we'll be discussing later, tells us a lot about this and about how legal coding, of course there is variation and resistance in different contexts, but at the same time it can catch on fast and have important systemic and almost network effects that need to be further studied. The final 2 points here are again, I guess, aimed at a sort of nuance of the varieties of capitalism thinking, which is that I think that institutional thinking sometimes focuses on what's happening in a particular country context, as opposed to looking at what's going on between states. And I think that it's important to think about the critical and significant differences of how international law, public international law, and international economic law are in many ways conditioning and in some ways less particular and less based in the local context than other legal regimes, and are having an important impact on the shape of the market there. Okay, so I think I'm quite short on time, so I won't linger on this point about what political economy can do for law, but I'll just say that I think that it encourages us to question some of law's most widely accepted doctrines. Maybe we can come back to that in the questions. But what I wanted to move on to was this, what I think is the meta question of LPE. So critical legal studies tends to take the view, as I've said, that making reform proposals can be premature, and that investigating and exposing the problem is the necessary and sufficient task of the scholar. And I think that may be because a lot of that early critical writing that was looking at law and political economy was very influenced by the Marxist tradition, although not necessarily uncritical of it, but as Lothian has highlighted, sees capitalism as a system of inseparable parts. So in Marxist theory, she says we cannot pick and choose among these different parts. In Law and the Wealth of Nations, Lothian argues that these structures are not indivisible systems incapable of piecemeal transformation, but are structures that can be transformed through institutional reforms. And I think that this really exemplifies the law and political economy approach. And I think it is much more concerned with other early legal writing in this area, with the development of potential institutional fixes or clever changes in the deep structures of law that can improve the machinations of capitalist political economy. So I see the meta question of LPE as being, does the deep legal infrastructure of capitalism create capitalism's structural tendencies in the long term? So I would say those structural tendencies are things like boom and bust cycles and tendencies toward crisis, inequality in wages and income that tends to be further entrenched, tendencies towards the increased financialization of the economy, that's another pattern that we've tended to see in capitalism over the long term, specialized economic production that relies on wage labor, and the increased concentration of land and property ownership, and also coming with that overexploitation of resources and environmental degradation. So, again, does the deep legal infrastructure of capitalism create those tendencies? And relatedly, can modifications in the deep legal infrastructure of capitalism alter those tendencies in the long term? I think institutional thinking has very much shown us that it can influence them in the short term, but I don't know that institutional thinking has showed us that it can really change them in the long term. Maybe others of you are aware of scholarship that has shown us that, and if so, I'd like to hear about it. So yeah, so that's what I see as being the meta question. Now, I'll just be very brief and great. Good. So here, what I was trying to do was, sorry, there's a bit too much text on that slide. Think about how some of the key texts that I said had set the intellectual coordinates for the law and political economy movement are in some ways very ambivalent about that question, about that meta question. So in Piketty, we see that, and I'm relying a lot on David Singrul's critique, sort of engagement with his book here. He sometimes describes this tendency that he's found that the return on capitalism has consistently outpaced the average growth of the economy. So explaining these patterns of inequality as a law, and other people have said that it should be called Piketty's law. But as Singrul points out, in fact, throughout the book, his book, he actually uses a very conflicting array of terms to refer to that law. So other times he seems to say it's a product of particular political circumstances or historical contingencies, and at other times he states it as the fundamental structural contradiction of capitalism. So there's a bit of a tension going on there. And what Singrul says is that we actually need to pay more attention to actual legal regimes, because of course Piketty's use of the term law is used in anything a way that an economist might use it rather than how a lawyer would use it. Equally ambivalent, I think, is Wolfgang Streeck, who, in an article that I engaged with for this talk, says that he's seeking to elaborate a concept of capitalism not as a self-driven mechanism of surplus extraction and accumulation governed by objective laws, but as a much more historically specific system based on social interactions and institutions, etc. However, in the remainder of that particular article, he does seem to be identifying very abstract and contextless ideal types of social relationship that are often enabled and enshrined in law, and that appear to create a kind of self-driven mechanism of surplus extraction and accumulation, or at least that's how I read it. And I think that the impression that his analysis creates is that a historically specific system of structured as well as structuring social interactions puts in place a mechanism that becomes self-regulating as long as the right institutional and legal components remain in place. So here, in the final green part of the slide, what I'm doing is, I guess, pushing back a bit against Lothian and her optimism that piecemeal structural reforms can have a deep impact, because I'm not sure that while that these are objective laws, but what I would say is that they are continually, that there is something systemic going on, and that there's something latent in the capacities. There are latent capacities deep in the private legal form, I think, or maybe to use Katerina Pista's language, the legal code, that in fact might tend towards these structural dynamics. So I think we would need to go very deep if we wanted to change those configurations in the long term. And finally on this slide, this was my attempt to deal with some of the questions set by the organisers, but perhaps I think I'll just end here and we could maybe come back if there's time. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. All right. So I want to thank Mario and Diego for the invitation to come back here. Some of you may know I spent several years as a faculty member at FGV. And though I won't be talking about Brazil explicitly in this presentation, I would have to say that my decision to come and spend years in Brazil was transformative for my own scholarship and continues to pay dividends in the relationships that I've established with both my colleagues and friends and students that I had while I was here. So even though I'm now in Hong Kong, if anything I say is remotely interesting to you, feel free to reach out. I'd love to continue those conversations. So I think I'm going to sort of emphasize one thing that Anna was discussing, which is this focus on institutional design. Okay? And the abstract that I submitted is a project where I'm trying to think through some of these ideas, new ideas about economic democracy that have come up in recent years. So it was traditionally before the financial crisis, if you said that you believed in economic democracy, you were relatively marginal in legal studies in a variety of ways, and specifically in corporate law. And even if you were sort of a relatively progressive center-left person, you saw more radical changes as actually a political liability, right? Don't talk about being too transformative. That's going to get in the way of sort of more gradual change. I think one of the things that law and political economy is speaking to is that this old sort of way of thinking has sort of been shattered, and that there's increasingly new space for not just presenting critiques, but also for the idea that people who sort of held to these ideas about economic democracy or democratic values in a variety of institutions now have the possibility of actually designing new institutions, right? That this sort of set of debates is looking at tools for sort of building things new as opposed to just sort of gradual reform or this type of critique. And so I think methodologically, this also raises this question of we have to move to look at the life of institutions and practices, right? And that we require a variety of methodologies to think about, even if we gained political power, and even if we could get the things passed as sort of policy proposals to have more radical change, we want to make sure those things actually work, right, before we put them into practice. So I think one of the really interesting things and tensions that comes out in this is that for a long time, if you believed in, had these ideas of economic democracy, you would go and you'd meet someone else who would say this, and you would sort of have like a little bit of a club effect where you were sort of very happy in your marginality, and you sort of would try to be very sort of emotionally supportive of each other. But as a result of this, there was a lack of sort of like self-criticism, and a lack of sort of confronting issues that I think are coming out now in the LPE movement, which is, as you would expect for anyone familiar with political theory, just because you think democracy or economic democracy is good, that covers a multitude of sins, right, and possibilities, right? So people who once thought that they were sort of like common travelers and their sort of critiques of capitalism are realizing once they have the possibility of designing new institutions that there's quite significant differences in how people conceptualize democracy, what they mean by economic democracy, right? Traditionally, many of these people focused on direct democracy, right? This is we change everything into a cooperative, we snap our fingers, and that's the new form of corporate governance, right? I think a lot of the new discussions of economic republicanism, in particular this idea that we actually have to have other concepts of democratic participation in the economy besides direct democracy, are important because the modern economies deal with issues of hierarchy and scale and expertise that aren't addressed in direct democracy models. So the abstract that I submitted for Day is trying to ask some of these questions in the context of this central economic institution of the contemporary age, which is the corporation. My former colleague at FGV, Mariana Pargendler, has this article, The Corporate Governance Obsession, right? Everyone wants to change the corporation as a way of retooling society because it's become so central in our economy. But today, if you look at traditional, dominant, sort of especially American-centric corporate governance literature, right, democracy has no place, right? Director primacy, the idea that democratic norms are in the workplace are as absent from debates about corporate governance often as they are from any other sort of like authoritarian regime's form of corporate governance. So we have this sort of excitement, right, that we might be able to reform the corporation, right? Things that, again, that were off the table 10 years ago are now all suddenly on the table. We're going to spread German co-determination to new companies, to new countries. Employee-owned corporations are going to be subsidized. But I think we're really addressing the possibility that instead of talking about these as general concepts, we really have to develop these as proposals that will be transformative of people's experiences and practice. But here's also the other key thing: we're going to be responsible for being functionally economically, right? So a lot of the traditional critiques of the corporation that want to infuse it with democracy as a self-evident good don't address in any way, right, how this is going to actually impact corporations as functional economic entities. And I think we've seen that the transition to sort of new pragmatic regimes is quite difficult. Some of you may know that after like the fall of the Soviet Union in '89, many post-Soviet companies all the shares were distributed to workers. The workers were 100% owners of all of these sort of post-Soviet corporations, and within a few years, they all transitioned to management buyouts. Okay? So what happened in that process, right? Why didn't sort of just throwing off the sort of authoritarian form of governance, giving the ownership to the workers, why did that not lead to long-term change? An even less studied example is in the 1990s, after the major sort of Australian recession, the government in New South Wales did a bunch of conversions of trying to change failed companies into cooperatives, right? A huge amount of subsidies, right? But without any sort of change in other aspects of regulation, all of these companies failed primarily within a decade. Right? So there were attempts before to radically transition certain types of corporations or corporate regimes into something that would be more in the democratic model, but they collapsed for a variety of reasons. So the three things, there's three things that I want to focus on in thinking through, right? So the first is then getting at this idea that we're going to have to confront these different conceptions of democracy that underlie these concepts of economic democracy, right? So for those of you who aren't familiar, the term economic republicanism that I've mentioned has become popular because it refers to the sort of like late 19th, early 20th century theories of sort of like labor republicanism in the United States, which focuses on non-domination, right, as a central core democratic value, but also, right, interdependence, right? So this is an idea that democratic norms require not just constraining vertical relationships, right, but constraining horizontal relationships. So if you're sort of in a context, you can have a very democratic, like local, village, but you're as oppressed by your co-equal democratic citizens as you may be by your representatives, right? And there's a lot of historical debates that sort of go into sort of Republican political theory. One of the interesting things as a legal scholar is actually, and one of the things that LP approaches try to look at, this has been discussed in other fields, non-law fields, for quite some time. So like political theorists have written about democratic conceptions of the corporation for decades now, from Robert Dahl and on. And also in business schools, business ethicists have written about different ways of running the corporation in these democratic models. Where that hasn't sort of impacted is in corporate and surprisingly labor law. Right? So one of these things in sort of these disciplinary silos that come up is like labor law is about unions and maybe about employment rights, and it's definitely not about corporate governance. And in corporate governance, right, is about agency issues and economic efficiency. It's not about democracy, and these sort of two sort of disciplines within law aren't in conversation with each other at all. And there's some, for this audience, maybe I don't have to go into sort of the debates that are developed there about why democratic norms are as appropriate to the corporate form as they are to like to democratic institutions. There's this long-standing sort of debate about the fact that participation in corporations is like optional, that they're supposed to serve different types of functions. I think in a lot of empirical contexts that's sort of been disproven. So besides these disciplinary divides, what emerge is that there's this discussion among political theorists and business ethicists that while they've developed these sort of like theoretical defenses of economic democracy, they don't actually know what this means in practice, right? And I think this is in part where law comes in. They're like, well, we should have more democratic, and you hear this all the time, we should have more democratic corporations, but what does that mean, right? Most political theorists don't get into that as specifically. And if you look at where these ideas of like economic republicanism are most popular, they're most popular in constitutional law. People like we should have constitutional principles, right, of economic democracy that are embedded in our entire systems of governance. But again, that doesn't get to what this means in practice. So Elizabeth Anderson, who has written this great book recently, talks about this idea of constitutional design for legitimate workplace governance. And this has been cited all over by a variety of scholars that this is a really good idea, but in practice, no one knows exactly what that is going to mean. So there are a variety of challenges. I think one of the major challenges is that, as these early examples of like the Soviet and Australian examples show, is that this idea that you can just sort of give workers shares or ownership of corporations is itself not transformative. I've written about this American version of employee stock ownership plans, where formally, in the different ways, the ownership of corporations is transferred to their employees. And one of the striking things about the result of that is how non-transformative that actually is for corporate governance. And I think a lot of these sort of traditional ideas about economic democracy, and part of the challenge in implementing them is they thought you needed to necessarily redistribute capital through a variety of different mechanisms in order to make this transition happen. And I think just as we don't make property ownership a criteria for democratic participation anymore, I think there's real limits to making property ownership the basis of sort of democratizing the economy. I think one of the more key issues is that the traditional critiques of corporate governance from the left, and I think especially for those who work in in the cooperatives or read the literature on cooperatives, there's a lot of sort of like utopianism that has become popular about how things will go when we're sort of freed from corporate authoritarianism, right? So once you sort of don't have sort of director primacy and you empower employees, everything is going to be perfect at that point, right? And I think there's this very sort of polarized characteristic to the study of democratic economics that comes from this perspective that, again, you believe in economic democracy, I believe in economic democracy, and so we really need to spend our time defending that as a normative concept, okay? So while corporate law, and I will not spend time there, is very dismissive of employee ownership and democratic norms in the workplace, what you have is a hyper-valorizing, idealizing sort of cooperatives literature, right? So anytime you say democratic economics, people have like a laundry list of things they automatically say, and one of them is like the Mondragon cooperatives in Spain. All we need to do is just take that model and extrapolate it everywhere. Well, the truth is, most of the most critical studies of the Mondragon cooperatives have shown that it's actually not a direct democracy model, right? It's highly corporatist. It's very authoritarian in a variety of ways. And I think this shift sort of needs to happen where we actually need to be able to do critical, direct, and as an anthropologist myself, even ethnographic studies to really think through how democratic corporations work in practice. Even the existing more democratic workplaces haven't been subject to a variety of sort of like institutional studies, right? It's mainly like I study sort of cooperatives are good, they're better than the corporate authoritarian, and so we don't want to actually air any dirty laundry because this is going to disrupt our sort of messaging about this. But it's led to the fact that, corporate law, especially the type of corporate law that we're trying to fight, has spent like 100 years trying to work out agency issues about how this type of corporate form operates. And we really haven't had commensurate development when it comes to democratic economics. And I think one of the sort of the legacies of this sort of being in this critical position is that a lot of the study of democratic workplaces, again, ignore the economic function of corporations, right? The idea is that they're purely supposed to be, valued because they are democratic, not because they have to compete in a particular market context. And there's an antipathy for any type of like bigness or market norms, right? So there's a lot that says like managerial expertise is like a myth, right? You don't need managers at all, right? I think that's probably like hierarchy. Cooperatives don't replicate, right? You don't get large cooperatives. The Mondragon, to the extent they have replicated, is because they develop very sort of like hierarchical, in some ways authoritarian forms. So I think there's a variety of core issues around sort of like how you would scale a democratic workplace, how you would manage human capital specialization, and how you would replicate different types of models across different types of market conditions and not assume that there's just one type of democratic workplace that would work in all of these ways. And I think one of the really critical things is that anytime you have a collective enterprise that has a particular set of goals, you need group discipline, right? And this is the one thing that sort of the utopianism about democratic workplaces has tried to align, which is like if you're going to discipline your members, right, and subordinate their personal desires towards group goals, you need some sort of democratic theory to legitimate that type of process, right? I think the appeal of just sort of having direct democracy where everyone votes on every single topic, right, is that you want to avoid these very sort of hard issues that come up. And I think this is why republicanism and its idea that you try to theorize legitimate hierarchy, right, and legitimate forms of interdependent sort of domination is really appealing, because just like in political democracy, there's huge debates about how you create, like, what's a good election, right? Arrow's theory is that there's there's no perfect election, right? So you just would have to ask the same types of hard questions about indirect representation, right? Accountability, all of these types of things would apply just as in complicated fashion to democratic workplaces as they would to general political democracies. And I think especially confronting the fact that that people actually have very diverse sort of concepts of the types of workplaces that they want to belong to, right? Not everyone wants to engage in intensive governance activities every time they're at work, right? Anyone who's been at a faculty meeting should be very sort of aware of this, right? So we have to have the idea that everyone doesn't necessarily want to be involved in every single corporate decision, but they don't want to be sort of subordinated and lose their agency as well, right? So there has to be some sort of critical in between that we look at in this context. Now, the last thing then, and I think this is relevant to the aims of what we're talking about today, is we have to realize that there is an endemic international character to any type of systemic reform in corporate law or otherwise, right? We're not just fighting battles within our own countries to pass particular legislation to initiate particular changes because of the way in which the global economy operates, right? We can't socialize our economy and turn it all into sort of like a syndicalist cooperative overnight. Capital still has incredible abilities to engage in regulatory arbitrage. And I think really like there's a new type of social compact that you have to sort of fight in any particular country to sort of reassess how an economy is organized, would have to confront new types of issues, right? Like like if you have a democratic corporations in your country, well, how do you deal with foreign corporations, right? How do you compete internationally with corporations of illiberal and authoritarian regimes, right? Can you have multilateral trade agreements and have a truly sort of like democratic corporation, or would we have to move to a system of both bilateral trade agreements and significant capital controls, right? To not allow countries both to have different types of corporations that operate internationally, or to have the sort of common phenomenon today of just companies being formed outside of the jurisdictions in which they operate. I think there's a lot of also potential, though, to readdress some of these significant issues and how corporations act as agents of development. Now, unfortunately, some of these ideas will maybe at some point die, but Americans have long been convinced that spreading our corporations abroad will help democratize the world for a variety of relatively insane ideas. But it's a really sort of strong face, right? So we're a robust democracy. Our corporations are and markets and all that stuff sort of goes together in this sort of magical elixir. But one of the things you find is that corporations tend to be, to the extent they can, as bad actors when they're removed from their domestic context as they can be. Ironically, right, many co-determined German companies, many cooperatives, including the Mondragon cooperatives, tend to be pretty bad corporate citizens when they're abroad as well and engaged in outsourcing and a variety of other sort of activities, right? So one of the things to think is if we move away from just sort of like ownership and some of the older models and really think about a new sort of theory about how sort of the operation of corporations should be, this is something that has to be sort of in their genetic DNA so that it applies to them equally as much when they're abroad as when they are at home, right? Otherwise, you're going to get these same type of arbitrage, these other type of arbitrage issues. So I think it's one of these ways in which a lot of what I think about when I think about the law and political economy movement is that we have this sort of like opportunity now to do things that were once considered to be implausible, right? The end of history, right? There's articles on the end of corporate law history, right? That grew out of sort of the Fukuyama unipolar American sort of like 90s. And we're not there now, right? But that means it's not just sort of an opportunity to do things that we wanted to do, but to ask hard questions that we weren't asking ourselves specifically about how our sort of vision for institutional redesign would operate, so that we don't sort of like squander this opportunity. I think Latin America has had its share of like regimes that have come on with very pro-worker orientations, and the actual sort of institutional reforms that they implemented didn't work out the way that they're ideally were constituted, and this has like generationally discrediting effects, right? We don't want to have a situation where we sort of have a more democratic oriented economic reforms, they don't work out in practice, and then this is another reason for them to sort of be seen as being unrealistic or unusual. That being said, right, I think I sort of propose this more sort of self-critical institutional agenda on point because it's an exciting time, right, where we can ask questions and see sort of the differences and work out these things that we really haven't confronted for so long because we were sort of working from the margins. So as much as this focuses on very serious technical legal questions, I think one of the things that sort of then characterizes LP in a variety of contexts is it's not just a method of diagnosis, which many critical legal theories have been, but it's really a method of reconstruction, all right? And that's sort of the hopeful period that we're in now, and that involves breaking down some of these older barriers, but really taking seriously that as legal scholars we have something to contribute critically to the success of these movements, and maybe hopefully directing populism in some of its less uglier forms to sort of legal forms that really enrich people's lives and give them a level of satisfaction at work that sort of spills over into sort of renewing the sort of democratic decay that we see in too many sectors of the world as the other way of sort of populism being channeled in the coming and recent years. So that's it. Thank you. corporations though. Just the last couple of years after I did this, I was a really big ESOP, this employee ownership proponent, and then I became disillusioned. So a lot of us came out of that. You should come to some of the political conferences. I know John Escola is starting two of these things in Europe, and like a summer school this summer, trying to do like a few different things.
No, there's like the conference at April, I think.
Yeah.
I'm going to apply.
Okay, yeah, but so I can make it's so much harder if I'm going to make it semester things for the US. It is like there's another association for political economy, and they're all these little, they all have very different constellations of things. So it's interesting.
Really, the only problem with the political economy blog is that it comes through thick and fast, and it's like with you. Whenever I've done the subscription to The Economist, I have such good intentions in it.
Yeah.
My presentation is about institutional arrangements as units of analysis in law and development scholarship. This is a much more microscopic focus as compared to what Anna and Jed said. I am trying to argue something very specific when it comes to doing research on law and development in light of things like law and political economy and legal institutionalism. Maybe this is an attempt to do law and development in connection with law and political economy and legal institutionalism. Perhaps this is an attempt to find convergence between these three approaches, or perhaps theories, perhaps methods, perhaps just approaches, perhaps just new ideas. This is, of course, work in progress, and it's based on some premises which I want to spell out before moving forward with the main claims and ideas that I want to discuss with you today. So, first premises are, it's very common, it's actually common sense that institutions matter for development. We hear this every time. Everyone says that, every economist, every political economist, everyone who does development studies has acknowledged, has recognized that institutions matter, but it's very difficult to understand, not easy question, not easy answer, how they matter, how actually they matter, why they matter, in what senses they matter, how to successfully transplant, even with a lot of careful adaptation, institutions to a context to another context. Even more difficult is to answer questions such as, is it possible to shape or change institutions to make them functional or to make them more democratic? Is it possible to design institutions that work effectively in, for instance, developmental policies? So these are unsolved questions, these are enigmas that we still have to face and carve out and dig in. The other premise that I'm departing from is that the developmental state is an institutional innovation in itself, and its success is explained by the relationships between the state, the economy, and civil society. My presentation, I should have said this before, is about development policies in the context of developmental states. And I'm talking about developmental states that try to implement policies which are politically defined. And of course that I'm talking about developing countries, most of all, moreover. And I'm talking about the type of policies that developmental and welfare states try to implement in the South, basically. Not only in the South, but in the South, basically. So another premise is that development requires state capacities. This is also common sense. Everyone knows that. Everyone speaks about this. and that includes capable, coherent, and accountable bureaucracies, Weberian bureaucracies. It requires a legal apparatus, and the law here is a crucial variable. Of course, it's again very difficult to understand how law works in development processes and trajectories. It's difficult to understand what law does and what roles law plays in such development strategies. But I'm assuming that it plays a role, and that role is important, that we have to understand what the role is, and we have to understand what kinds of functions the legal apparatus plays. Specifically, I'm assuming that the legal apparatus, that the law embedded in those developmental policies is key, because it helps implementing those policies, because the law built in those development strategies is key for policies to become effective or ineffective, more legitimate or less legitimate. That's why law can be an institution or a force or something that fosters or hinders democracy, or perhaps creates a more democratic environment for development or not. My claim here, again, it's rather methodological instead of theoretical or broad or open, is that institutional arrangements can be seen as key units of analysis for the law and development scholarship, but also for legal institutionalism and for law and political economy. Because institutional arrangements can illuminate the law embedded in development policies without dissecting it. That is, without extracting the law from its institutional and political economic contexts. So, looking at institutional arrangements is a way to envisage, to see, to observe the law in action, as opposed to in books, in context, in the context of implementing politically taken decisions. So, to quote some authors that have been discussing the idea of law and political economy, institutional arrangements can present real-world events and developments in law and political economy, rather than taking law, politics, or economics as autonomous disciplines to be studied through pure methods. But a key question again is, what are institutional arrangements? Difficult to define, because as someone said, I think it was Adam Przeworski, defining institutions is itself a very difficult task. I think that it was Przeworski who said that institutions is one of the most employed words in social sciences, but one of the most difficult words to define, terms to define. So institutional arrangements can be broadly defined as rules and procedures that agents establish in their economic and political relationships, but more narrowly, institutional arrangements are structures of coordination that define in specific processes, and I'm referring to policies here, their scope and subject, who participates, who does what, and the relationships between or among actors involved. This is what institutional arrangements are. And they are institutional because they coordinate actors, and also because they can constrain or enable behavior. They are also policy and legal environments. I mean, institutional arrangements are also legal environments in a sense that they have law embedded on them. Public policies can be seen as law being implemented, and institutional arrangements are the kind of are the structure of those policies, of those developmental policies that have the law inserted on them. And looking at institutional policies is a way to observe the law amalgamated in those structures, in a sense, or in the process or in the motion of trying to pursue those goals, as I said. Why am I saying that looking at institutional arrangements can be helpful for the legal scholarship? And why am I saying that legal arrangements can bridge some theoretical gaps? My argument here is that while very refined and sophisticated in political science and sociology and economics, institutionalism and institutional analysis are nonetheless still insufficiently developed by legal scholarship, at least when it comes to developmental studies. That's not a coincidence that when they address social change and development issues, economists, sociologists, and political scientists often venture into legal norms, actors, and institutions and processes without the expert backing of legal sources. And this is a fact that the social scientists very openly acknowledge and resent. So it's not uncommon, it's very common that political scientists, that sociologists and economists claim that law does this or does that. They talk about law and they very often criticize lawyers, or maybe they don't do that, but they very often resent the fact that there isn't much literature about law and institutions. And what happens is that these social scientists end up talking about law even without that backing. They miss lawyers in that discussion. And it's not coincidence the fact that law is very often seen or described as exogenous, as to quote Hodgson, as an epiphenomenon, in political economy explanations and in development theory. So law is missing in social sciences that deal with institutions, that deal with institutional change, and that's a gap. Of course, that lawyers have been trying to fill the gap, have been trying to bridge the gap. One strand that has been doing that is legal institutionalism, a new initiative. Katarina Pisser, Hodgson, and others have been trying to do this, and they claim, for instance, that besides being an expression of power relation, law is also a constitutive part of the institutionalized power structure, and law is also a major means through which power is exercised. And other claims, very important research has been done, has been appeared recently on legal institutionalism, but just to tease and to start a conversation, legal institutionalism has not yet moved as far as to propose parameters, let alone a method, to visualize, to analyze, and to perhaps reform or perfect the law injected in capitalist institutions and policies, because law and institutionalism has recently started its effort, its tour de force, so still has a lot of things to do. And on the other hand, law and political economy, similar but not equal, not the same initiative which has been presented, which has been growing and flourishing recently, which claims that law gives shape to the relations between politics and the economy at every point, that claims that the law is the mediating institution that ties together politics and economics. But again, law and political economy hasn't so far, at least, developed analytical tools to understand how law and an institution itself shapes capitalist institutions. So if I'm right in these provocations concerning law and political economy and legal institutionalism, the gap is still there. So we still have a long way forward to propose legal institutional analysis, or a method, a legal method, or perhaps a method in which law contributes to face or to deal with the challenge of understanding institutional change, or institutional building, or institutional design, and I'm referring again more specifically to development policies. Institutional analysis adds to law and to political economy something, and it does the same to legal institutionalism. At the same time, it can offer a methodological path, not only one or not only method possible, but one among others, to law and development too. There is no single way to do institutional analysis, but institutional analysis is something that lawyers could be doing more, and this is something that could perhaps bring together or reconcile these three trends that somehow relate to each other, that are trying to follow their own path, but have important synergies between them. I'm referring to law and development, I'm referring to legal institutionalism, and also to law and political economy. This is so because institutional arrangements are at the core of institutional and legal analysis, and therefore institutional arrangements as part of institutional analysis can be seen as strategic and convergent lenses. So if I could locate institutional arrangements here, I put it here, right in the middle of these circles, because institutional arrangements could be seen as something that puts together law and development, legal institutionalism, and law and political economy. And if we could, I'm referring to lawyers. If we lawyers could better analyze those institutional arrangements, we could have something more integrated. This is just an idea, law and institutional political economy for development, and at least for the acronym LIPT. This is a good idea, well, at least for the acronym. So I'm not saying that it's all about acronyms. What I'm saying is that we could have an agenda that could merge these interesting, very rich initiatives if we could look at those institutional arrangements, for instance, as two Brazilian social scientists have proposed, Gomidi and Pires, like this. Sorry that I didn't translate this into English, but in this axis, the vertical axis, you have political capacities behind institutional arrangements. That means how legitimate, how democratic they are. This is very high level of democratic content within institutional arrangement. This is low, and the horizontal axis is for technical capacities behind, that underlie or not, that lack in institutional arrangements, and the more towards the right institutional arrangements are located, more effective in technical terms they are. So when you combine effectiveness or technical capacities with political or legitimacy capacities, you have different possibilities. You have very undemocratic, perhaps authoritarian, and at the same time very unable and inefficient or ineffective institutional arrangements here. You have very democratic and efficient, perhaps effective institutional arrangements here. you can try to locate or insert perhaps the development policies X or Y in this graph, or perhaps you could add or locate here countries. Perhaps you can compare different policies with a graph like this. Here you have very deliberative, participative, and perhaps democratic institutional arrangements, which are at the same time ineffective. They don't work, they don't deliver. And here you have very effective institutional arrangements, which are less participative, which tend to be authoritarian. Perhaps Chinese institutional arrangements for development can be here. So this is just a very simple example of how to deal or how to look at institutional arrangements, but this is, again, this is broad because you can do something different. You can, for instance, look at institutional arrangements more deeply, and if you're a lawyer, perhaps you can reverse engineer such institutional arrangements and try to debunk those arrangements in case studies, interdisciplinary but also legal, to understand or to trace what interests play what role. That means seeking what are the power relations between those arrangements. You can look at the interplay between structure and agency, to refer to this classical debate on social sciences, so that you can understand how things change, to what extent changes result from agency, to what extent changes result from the structure itself, or more likely, to what extent change results from the complex interplay between agency and structure. And again, institutional arrangements as units of analysis can somehow, I don't know exactly how, show how these variables interact. At least it shows more than when you look at the law formalistically speaking. So it's a way to look at the law in action. You can try to understand or to detect or to assess how effective they prove to be, those institutional arrangements. You can try to understand what works and what doesn't work. A very simple way to describe what law and development is. Mariana Mota Prado has once defined law and development as what works in law and development, or in development policies, in terms of legal arrangements. You can also try to understand what roles are played by the law, so you can try to better grasp functions played by the legal apparatus. And when I refer to institutional arrangements in social or in development policies, I'm talking about tax policies, I'm talking about regulation, I'm talking about industrial policies, I'm talking about the variety of typically developmental policies that have been implemented, but also I'm talking about the type of policies that every state implements. So again, this is broad, but you can zoom in, as Anna said, to better understand what is involved there. You can also try to detect bottlenecks that can be somehow attributed to the law. Because if it's true that law hinders development, you have to understand why and how. It's something that lawyers have to do. I mean, you have to be able to understand where the exact legal bottleneck is that at the end of the day compromises or jeopardizes the effectiveness or the legitimacy of those arrangements that in turn give the skeleton to those policies, to those developmental policies. Also, you can try to, if you're very successful, if you're very lucky in that task, you can try to find ways to improve state capacity. So lawyers can be somehow social or legal engineers or legal institutional engineers if they can if they can look at those institutional arrangements more self-consciously, more closely, using those institutional arrangements as units of analysis for things that we want to do. And again, I'm talking about developmental policies, but I could be talking about other institution structures too. But I'm focusing here on institutional change in developmental policies, because I think that if it's true that the developmental state is itself an institutional innovation, if it's in itself something that has been created and has to be perfected in terms of effectiveness and legitimacy, lawyers have a task, have a duty in that case. I think I'll stop here, quoting this guy, who's this person? This is something that Cal Polanyi said in The Great Transformation back in 1944. How can we make institutions able to make rights effective? So when I read this, I thought this could be an interesting quote, because it connects institutions with rights. And between institutions and rights there is policy, and within policy there is law. So this is to me a challenge in terms of legal scholarship. And I don't know if I am right in saying or stating or cluing that institutional arrangements can reconcile law and development, legal institutionalism in law and political economy, but this is just an attempt. I think that in order to test this hypothesis, we have to do this kind of study. We have to look at this with the rich background that people who have been theorizing about law and development, legal institutionalism, and law and political economy, such as Katarina, Anna, Jed, David, and many of who have been trying to do this. Some people who are not here, of course, and if we can somehow deal with this broader literature, theoretic approaches with more focused and empirical and applied case studies, we can provide some gain, some intellectual gain, some analytical gain to this big area, to this as a whole. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have some time for questions, and I'm gonna raise some questions to the panelists. My first question is to Anna. And I'm curious about what are the sources for institutional change in the law and political economy movement. And in the institutional approaches, give a variety of answers to this puzzle of institutional change. So, for instance, the new institutionalism, like the one by Douglas North, point out the relationship between institutions and the transaction costs as the source of institutional change. And the other side, the historical institutionalism, like the Wolfgang Streeck and Kathleen Tellen, emphasize the structural push of marketization as a permanent source of institutional arrangement since the second post-war. Since the Second World War. And in your presentation, you try to differentiate the law and political economy movement from the other institutionalist views on political economy. So I'm curious about how, in your framework, you conceptualize the institutional change, or where does the institutional change come from? Okay. To Jed, following Anna's presentation, you went very deep in the institutional details. So you discussed or you emphasize how understanding law is a key to debate institutional reform, and it seems to me that you picked corporation as an illustration of this, the relevance of going deeper in law to discuss institutional reforms. But corporation, it seems to me, that is more than law. For instance, the co-determination arrangement of Germany or the shareholder-oriented model of USA come from political economy, come from law, come from a very complex arrangement. So my question here is, don't you think that by isolating law as a very specific topic, we could convert the political economy debates in a very technocratic one? So, and to Diogo, in terms of scholarship, Diogo, I wonder what is the scholarship that law and institutional political economy contributes to? So what is the contribution of this field more precisely? As lipped as you described it, is it improving? Is it trying to improve the studies on development studies or institutional studies, or are you interested, or the movement as a whole, interested in improving law, taking the insights and inputs from the political economy to improve the legal academia, or are you interested in going from law to improving the political economy academia? So, and then I think that you can reply, and then we can open for Q&A.
Do you want to go first, or I can?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people who talk about these democratic norms, like technocratic is a bad word, right? And I think technocratic is a bad word for good reasons, in the sense because it's gotten this illusion that you can deal with sort of like technical issues of development and reform without politics, right? I mean, this is one of these sort of classic critiques, which I think is very much true, and it's part of the failure of sort of the financial crisis world, was that people increasingly were dissatisfied of this as a basic way of sort of framing debates. But I do think, right, that there are still serious like technical questions, right? And so I'll pose two things that sort of extrapolating from my talk, and I'll throw in one Brazilian example. So the first is, if you think about it, one of the classic issues in democratic political theory is majoritarianism, right? So you have a completely empowered democratic workplace where 51% of the workers, right, could completely dominate the other 49%, and then what do, right? A great deal of constitutional theory deals with this issue, right? This doesn't resolve issues of like other minoritized group, any sort of like intersectional, a frame can look at, this doesn't deal with issues of like sexual harassment, racial discrimination, etc. These are classic issues in political theory that you deal with, like how do you actually have a functioning democratic system? This comes down to legal questions about how you orient voting shares, right? What types of issues can be voted on, which things are sort of off the table, right, beyond the ability of the corporation to determine for itself. So I think there are like serious technical questions, right, that are not necessarily technocratic in orientation. Another example, which also gets to this, how this ties into concepts of democracy. So I wrote this paper a few years ago comparing the democratic structures of Brazilian, Chinese, and American unions. And I presented this at a lot of labor law conferences, and people were very not happy about this particular paper, because part of the argument I meant is that it's very common for labor people to say that unions should be more democratic. And part of the argument I made is you actually look at the most successful union system in recent developmental history, and it's the Brazilian one. And contrary to what many people outside of Brazil think, Brazilian unions, as you well know, are not democratic at all. And in fact, their success, I argued in the paper, is in part because, right, they're not accountable in the way that American unions try to be. American unions are organized on the enterprise level. Workers have a great deal of veto over what their union representatives used to do. And so it's always posited that the solution is just to make unions more democratic. It's also sort of not ironic at the time that a lot of the critical scholarship in Brazil, as you know, criticized Brazilian unions as not being democratic and said things like we should take away the mandatory dues that CUT and other unions get, right, as a solution. Well, I'm sure people don't say that anymore now that it actually happened, right? Because the functional power of Brazil, what's the first thing that Tamara did, right? It's like take away the mandatory dues because he knew this undermined, right, the corporatist power of unions as a social democratic institution. Right? Well, that social democratic concept of democracy is very different, right, than the union democracy concept of like individual members like voting, right? So this is a real like serious issue where even if that might apply in some contexts but not others, right? Simply saying something is democratic doesn't answer these very serious sort of technical questions about how institutions are arranged, and it may be different in different contexts, right? It may be that we want to have a very democratic sort of corporate law, but that doesn't mean that we don't want to have still a very corporatist, union system that goes along with it, right, at the same time. But that sort of, when you look at the interaction of those institutions, that's not going to be resolved about fighting about which type of democracy is better in a normative sense. It's going to be which one of these actually works functionally better in these different market segments, right? So.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, so thanks for this excellent question. Is this on?
Is on. Perhaps.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Okay, why don't you use this one?
I'll use this one.
Here, we'll combine them.
Okay, now I have multiple options. Okay, I'll go with this one. So thanks for that excellent question. I think that is a really important question. And I think that I would stand with Diogo and say that I don't think it's been fully worked out yet what the specific contribution of law is to thinking about the nature of institutional change. I think it's still being worked out. And I wouldn't pretend that what I was doing in this presentation was doing that exactly. I think it was approaching aspects of it maybe. But I think I would say that one thing we could say is that the legal perspective brings in new actors, institutions, and processes that have not been as visible in other institutional accounts than they perhaps should have been, or that have been visible but, as I mentioned, maybe have been in some ways essentialized, and so there's a need for a deeper scrutiny of the nature of contract and its complexities, etc. So I think bringing in the particular role of courts and the processes of precedent and judicial reasoning is very interesting to think about how that might impact upon institutional change. I think the work that Katerina has been doing in terms of the legal theory of her recent book puts a lot of focus on the particular importance of private lawyers as a new source of agents, which haven't been paid attention to very much at all in the institutional literature. And I also think that there's something very interesting with this intralegal approach that is, thinking about how maybe what changes in corporate law, like a shift to shareholder value, how that then impacts on workers' rights, etc. So those kind of institutional dynamics between different legal regimes. I also think that maybe we could also say that the legal focus might lead us to think of certain limits on institutional change as currently conceptualized. So, for example, the role of constitutions, I think, is very important in terms of thinking about how it may not be possible to alter certain forms of institution, either at the state level or sub-state level, or at the level of corporate governance, or at the level of the corporate form, without in some ways compromising certain norms that are given us certain special protection in the Constitution that are in many ways not just constitutive of markets and a market economy, but are also constitutive of our sort of form of political and social interaction and identity. So I think there's a sense in which law may place limits on the way that other institutionalists have thought about markets. And then a final point that I'd say is something that I think is very interesting that has been raised in a couple of articles that definitely are in line with the legal institutionalist / law and political economy way of thinking, which is this idea that actually law may play a role in structuring the cognitive the capacities of agents. So law can structure the behavior of Homo economicus and how he behaves in the markets. So I think that is another very interesting dynamic that hasn't been adequately explored in the existing institutional literature.
Thank you for your question, Mario. I think it's both. I think that doing this type of research, not necessarily this one, but the type of research that tries to understand the law and its relationship with political economy and its relationship with institutions, at the same time enriches the institutional field or approach, which is transversal, which is not property or not related, exclusively related to economics, to sociology. It's something that gathers social scientists, but at the same time, it also adds something to the legal scholarship because it brings us closer to social scientists. I'm not referring to practitioner lawyers, of course. I'm referring to mostly to legal scholars who will not feel insecure or uncomfortable to work with social scientists without losing its identity or his or her identity. I think that it could bring us closer to those people and make us feel as part of the social scientist team, instead of being always the lawyer or the person who is going to bring or who's going to add some technical expertise, who will solve the type of problems that usually lawyers solve. Someone who's going to think of institutional change or think of institutional design more closely. So I think it's win-win in that sense. But again, we have to test this.
We have time for questions, and we'd like to have questions. You can raise questions in English or in Portuguese if you prefer. Dave is the first.
So this is a question, it's really an observation. I'll make it very quick because I want to hear from more of the audience. But I find myself in a very strange position that in the last 2 months I have looked at law and political economy as a movement in the United States, at the history of critical legal studies, which we're now doing a historical analysis, and at institutionalism and the work of Mr. Store for the preparation for this meeting and our global travels around the world to discuss these questions. And I'm struck with this. Of course, the first difference with critical legal studies and these two is that critical legal studies was more normatively driven than institutionalism and more critical and not constructive than law and political economy tends to be. And I think that is historical discussion to that point. I think that in looking at the law and political economy enterprise in the United States, which is now an organization with an executive director, it is very important to have an executive director, so this means they're really moving ahead, is that it's all lawyers. If you look at the blog, the list of names, it's all lawyers, all the way down. There are some of these lawyers who do political economy and may have doctorates like Gaywall and some of these people, but they're all law professors. While you look at Weiner, and there aren't that many lawyers. I mean, as a percentage, they're probably equal with some others, but they're certainly not dominant. And they're not trying to change the world. They're trying to understand the world, and maybe they think, from what I can gather, and Katharina can correct me, it isn't the center of the agenda in the meetings, exactly how you change the world, although I see some of that. While in law and political economy, it's about changing the world. And now, and this is, I think, the most important thing, yes, 2008 was a turning point. 2020 election is another thing. Because these people in political economy in American law schools think take state power. And they are modified, confronting the possibility. So it's more than just an academic movement. It's a sense, it's a movement within legal education in America. I don't know what's going on outside that thinks with the incredible shift to the left of the Democratic Party that left academics may be able to have a direct influence on power. Now that is the biggest difference between just critical legal studies, which after all flourished in the years of Ronald Reagan, and nobody ever thought it would affect state power.
Katrina and Camila.
So, listening to all three presentations, my sense was that all of you were saying in different ways that the unit of analysis institutions is too small, right? So I think Anna's presentation was basically saying we have to understand the relationship between institutions and structures. And even if institutions create structures, once the structures are in place, it's actually not clear that institutional change will have an effect on such structures. And I think Jed was basically saying something similar, saying, co-ops can behave like corporations, right? Corporations, so we can, put co-ops sort of in the world, but they just will do the same thing. So that also, I think, suggests that what we have to understand is the context in which different forms of organizations operate, or even beyond that, saying that the efficacy of complex organization depends a lot on maybe a hierarchical structure, right? And so that then this whole democratic economy is more of an illusion, but it also says that we have to look at the interaction between specific types of institutions and the context in which they operate. And I think you were most explicit about this, basically saying we have to move up a level from specific legal institutes to what you call institutional arrangements. As a sub note to that, I was just thinking, Aoki and Abner Drive and others, they have definitions of institutions that sound very much like your institutional arrangements, because they're looking at outcomes, right? So it's how it's collective expectations of behavior and how they realize in practice rather than norms in the books. So I think there are different definitions of institutions, but I think what you were saying, if you want to look at the effectiveness or efficacy of particular measures and want to look at that and then maybe identify how important law was in there, or another institution might have been in there, but we should go up one notch. And I'm just wondering whether you want to reflect a little bit on that by saying maybe we should just not hold on to institutions' rule, because if we really want to think about institutional change, which is, I think, the big topic here, then we have to think not only about the institutions themselves, but their interaction with structures, and find maybe entry points, vulnerabilities of existing structures to make a real difference.
Thank you very much. I work for the University of São Paulo. I have a special question to Dedi. I think it's really, really interesting your work linking labor law with corporate law. And it remembers me the work of Linarelli from Duran. He talks about the misery of international laws, the real impact of fragmenting international economic law and human rights. I think for us working on law and political economy, we can think about human rights having a constitutive role in the same way property and contracts have for economic relations. I think in your field, corporate social responsibility, CSR is trying to do this job. But just to provoke, how in fact CSR is contributing to reinforcing the neoliberalization of human rights? And in the same way, how your approach bringing ethical reflections on this issue and connecting labor law with corporate law could have this danger, the same effect of neoliberalizing human rights.
I've been studying law and we have more or less, I've been facing more or less the same question. What is the specificity of law in this debate? How can I that? Or with sociologists that have been, or scholarship that have been studying social movements for a long time. And during this process that I've been thinking what is my scholarship? Because I have been also making this kind of meta questions of what's my role in this dialogue and what is my scholarship and etc. I found specific importance to study actors, and it was important for me to study actors because in the legal field they are in the disputes in the legal fields, actors are very important. So I found myself studying activists, how they use the law, how lawyers and different, how judges. So actors have been an important unit of analysis to understand this dialogue. And so my question is, how is the role of actors? I mean, Diogo mentioned institutions as units. How can we really operationalize these studies without actors?
My question is more directed to Jedediah. Am I saying that right? Jed. All right. So, louder. All right. So you made a very clear point that as corporations are a central institution of market economies, we have repeatedly attempted to reform them and repeatedly failed to do so. And you also point out that in all of those attempts, the failure was mainly due to the fact that those changes were directed to the form of decision making, to internal changes in those corporations. So we've pursued democratic values such as collective decision making and horizontality and so on and so on. But the results of those democratic values were not democratic itself. Rather, they resulted in economic inefficiency, which in turn leads to a lack of democratic efficiency, so to speak. So you also cited how the disconnection of labor law from corporate law is part of the reason of the failure of the change, because we're only changing the internal organs of corporations, but we're not changing the context in which they operate. So would an attempt to maybe successfully try to reform corporations, to try to reform the environment in which they operate, rather than just simply trying to change the form through which they operate? So in trying to make corporations democratic agents, should we strengthen other democratic agents, such as activists that fight for other type of environment regulations and activists that fight for other type of labor regulation? Is the way to changing corporate management and corporate law, changing other fields of law?
I would like to start from your focus on institutional arrangements, because I think brings in this element of, as I think Adrian was mentioning, not just looking at institution per se, but looking at the context of power, the context of different interdependent type of mechanisms and processes that can lead to something that we define as an institution or something that appears as an institution. Like when I think about the second part of the conference type of development, and I spend lots of time across these countries in Africa, law doesn't mean anything if there is no enforceability. So, and as you know well, I mean, this is the big topic in developmental state, right? What was the difference between failed developmental state and successful developmental state was the degree of institutional design that was going into the enforceability of the rules of law and the rents allocation that was coming out from any type of industrial policy or development policy that were put in place. So when I look at your graph with these two axes, I think the critical issue is how do we understand that vertical axis in terms of the political legitimacy of the political push for something, and that brings back to another set of axes, which is around the configuration of organized power in a certain context, which I think is the core. I mean, if there is something which is, as an economist, a political economist, which is the classical political economist understood and we lost, is that there is an element of a link between a certain type of economic structure and certain type of emergence of organized power. And if we don't unpack that relationship, we are unable actually to understand that vertical axis and the extent to which policies that go on the horizontal one can be enforceable or not. So my question is really, if you could share more thinking around, because I'm sure you've been thinking about some of these issues, how do you factor in the enforceability aspect, which I think is critical, especially in countries where, as I said, and I will talk a bit about in my session on corruption, law per se doesn't mean anything, right? Because we have, basically informal economy. Coming to the first two presentations, I thought I really share lots of your points around, the utopianism around corporation. I think the attention to the detail, especially when we look at corporate governance reforms and so on, is absolutely critical. And I think we need to bring in even accountants and people who know how some of these issues in practice works. But I found interesting the link between your two presentations, and the question is related to that. In your first presentation, Ryan, you mentioned, we don't need necessarily to get all the classical political economy understanding of the economic theory behind certain issues. But if I think about how I want to reform corporate governance, I need to understand actually have a theory of value, which is not necessarily a Marxian theory of value, but something that allows me to understand how value is created and what are the different institutional arrangements historically have led to different forms of reinvestment of that value, which create more sustainable prosperity over time, and on the other end, the way in which that is basically distributed within corporation. And here I think the work that William Lazonic has done in looking at what financialization means in the context of the US and how that has been killing the fundamental mechanism that was creating sustainable prosperity in the US is critical. So my understanding is, my question would be, what is your theory in your case of the corporation which allows you to think through the laws or the democratization process that you would like to see in place?
Okay. I always tell this story. This is the Brazilian style, where you take like all the questions at once, and then you give a long speech, right? Which you may or may not address the questions that were asked. I was once at a conference in Malta, and I tried to force people to like ask one question and answer one question, but I was the only man at a conference on feminist theory, and I quickly decided that I was not going to enforce that norm on the group. It's one of my instructive moments in my cultural education. So I think these are all great questions, and in part they allow me to elaborate on some other things. I think one thing about Dave's comments is that I think the political economy thing is it's much more diverse. I think like the LPE thing coming together at Yale, because it's like Yale Law gets a lot of visibility, right? But there's Frank Pasquale and Martha McCluskey's appeal group, which has tons of economists, people from all like the public think tanks sort of like engaged. And in different countries, this manifests differently because like, who are the social reformers, right? The American model is like the law professors have a particular salience and connection to political power that is not replicated in other countries, right? So this is why like INET's progress, like working on economists in a lot of countries, they're the ones who staff like, antitrust authorities, not necessarily lawyers, right? So I think one of the interesting things is seeing how it migrates in different international spaces, because the decision makers who think about these questions and are going to implement the reforms, even if they are like law related, may not be sort of like lawyers themselves, right? And that's one of the interesting things. We have to be in conversations with other disciplines, because even if we think law is relevant, right, legal academics and legal intellectuals might be the ones best positioned to do that. I think one of the things that I emphasize in the longer sort of like project is the limits, right, of reforming the corporation, right, and sort of like the larger sort of like regulatory ecology that's involved. And I think this does actually implement social movements, because one of the things that's like very clear, right, if you don't have like a labor movement, generally speaking, it's very hard to have any sort of like meaningful technical reform, right, that's going to sort of in a longitudinal sense transform things, right. And I think we've seen very successful transnational movements that push financialization and other things, right, which are bad models, like the Atlas Group, right, that the Heritage Foundation sponsors in Brazil, right, and all of a sudden there's ideas of like libertarian meritocracy and Brazilian political discourse that was in part sponsored, right, by like American think tanks. I mean, this ability to sort of like have social movements be effective in the regulatory realm, we have lots of bad examples, and I think one of the things we're struggling with is we want to have good examples, right? What's a good new sort of like labor movement, right, that can both operate in individual countries, but operate transnationally, because, as I mentioned, even with like corporate reform, these are all things that you can't do on an individual state-by-state basis. And so the question that gets into about changing things outside of the corporations, right? I think what you see with these failures is if you just tweak one thing and the larger regulatory ecology doesn't support that, it's going to collapse. And I think that's very clear in like the human capital context, right? If people go through their whole lives through every educational institution, every workplace, being trained to be subordinate in the workplace, and all of a sudden you tell them now run the corporation, right? They've never developed the skill set right, to do that, right? It's never been a part of their like civic education. It's never been discussed, right? How do you manage a corporation, right? That's a specific sort of like set of skills, right, that you can't just go from anything. So this is like the Soviet example, right? You give everyone shares. They're like, we don't know what to do, and it's stressful, and we don't want to deal with it. So we'll just sell our shares back to the managers and let them sort of run things. So you see in these things that just what workers and people who come into the corporation have had a whole social life, right, that affects how they would potentially operate, even if they were given more agency inside the corporation. And so, as far as like the theory, I mean, this is part of like why I like this economic republicanism theory, right? Is because it's a political theory of democracy that says like hierarchy, indirect representation, right, mutual self-restraint is part of is sort of an important part of this, because right, the ideas of like majoritarianism, you just change the formal voting structure, right? There's so many different potential voting structures that you could have. You can't just sort of tinker with them. You have to have a theory, right, about how those are supposed to operate and empower different people within the corporation who may have different interests, right? Henry Hansman has this like classic and in many ways sort of like cogent critique of employee ownership by saying workers have heterogeneous interests, shareholders have homogeneous interests, right, and profit. That's not necessarily true, but it is true, right? There's no idea like anyone who spends any time doing any labor movement organizing, the idea that like there's a worker's interest, right, or that it's some sort of uniform thing that people share doesn't really exist, right? You have to create ways of people being able to express their differences in this particular way. And so you can see that like there's so many things that even a perfect way of changing corporations isn't going to solve this. So in the US, there's this big scandal that Publix, this very large supermarket chain that's employee owned, was like giving money to like pro-gun and anti-LGBT groups, right? And people in like the employee ownership world were like aghast. How can an employee owned supermarket do these horrible things? Well, it just I mean, there's a lot of complicated things about Publix, but maybe the people in that company, was their political beliefs, right? Just because you empower people to express themselves democratically doesn't mean that they're going to necessarily express themselves in a constructive way, in a progressive way. And this is why for me, like the CSR, and this is also business and human rights is a new sort of hot topic. Yeah, I mean, I believe in this like zero, right? I've made a number of friends. I've made a number of not friends in the larger international law world, in part because, right? I mean, when it comes down to it, I think one of the things besides everyone loves Polanyi about law and political economy is you have a belief that you have to solve some problems through hard regulation. Right? You can't make everything sort of like optional, right? Or something like, it's like you have trade-offs. You can't just sort of like maximize profit and then CSR is some sort of justified by some sort of cost-benefit analysis as like a form of advertising, right? Unless you have these enforcement mechanisms, and the business and human rights people are in this sort of like conundrum where it's like you can sign a new treaty, right, and say that corporations are going to do this. But if your like domestic jurisdiction doesn't have criminal liability for corporations, almost all of the remedies that you could potentially imagine to enforce aren't going to be there, right? And especially if people are operating in multiple types of countries. So that's why this is when I talk about the potential for changing corporate law for international development is you have to hardwire some of these things, right, into corporations that may not necessarily be what even the corporations would democratically choose for themselves, because there are larger social concerns that you can't just fix, right, by tweaking the internal structure or making things necessarily democratic. So I think the part of like all the people when they talk about antitrust or corporations, one of the things in LP, it's always that there's a regulatory ecology where all of these parts interact with each other, right? And you can't sort of have this like micro focus. You have to look at like this type of interaction. And there are some things that just are really basic social like realities, like how education creates people who then enter into the workplace, that are going to be fundamental, that transcend all of these types of issues. So you can't sort of like let up, which is why you have to have a larger social movement that has a vision of society, right, that goes beyond these sort of small technical changes, or you end up in sort of, Marius, a technocratic world where you think you can continue to solve problems by having better and better best practices when there's fundamentally sort of like flawed things in society that prevent even the best institutional arrangements on paper from operating or being enforced in reality.
Thank you, James.
Okay, so thanks for your comments and questions. I'll just try and answer them all briefly. So first, thanks to David for the point about the link between the LP movement in the US and state power. I think that's very, very important and something that I need to pay further attention to. I think in the UK, it hasn't evolved in that same way. So I think that's a really interesting point of divergence there. Thanks also to Katerina. I think that you're right. You sort of hit the nail on the head in terms of what I was getting at with this link between institutions and structure. I don't know if I would say, I think whether institutions are too small. I think in some way, as a unit of analysis, I think in some ways yes, but I think it again speaks to this big question that hasn't yet been resolved of what is an institution, and I also think an interesting thing to think about is whether law is in some ways, I don't know if sui generis is the right word, but a very particular institution that has certain features that a lot of the other institutions that have been typically analysed through institutionalist thought haven't necessarily featured. So when we think about the particular role of constitutions, I think there's something very interesting there, and courts, and also what you point to in your book, and which we'll talk about later, this, the special malleability and yet at the same time entrenched capacities of certain rules in private law, which I was just thinking then, it's almost like the foundations have sort of been approved and in some ways put beyond democratic control, like the foundations of the structure of the building, but then it's like these are walls that can walk and sort of have all these capacities that then are somehow going far beyond what was imagined maybe when they were first entrenched. On the point about actors, and I think it's really important to look and think about the special role that actors play, and I think that your point about activists is actually really interesting as well. I think that maybe could be another way in which law is really interesting, in that there's this special body of people who are engaging with it in a particular way. So we have private lawyers, we have lawyers, judges, etc. But maybe like looking at how activists are engaging is interesting. One thing I would say is that I think it's important not to think about actors using the law instrumentally, just using the law, but rather also to think that they are acting in an arena that's conditioned by law, and that law is also structuring how they act and how they engage in their activism. So I think that could be something interesting to explore further. And then I think Antonio, on the point about value. So yeah, I think this is, I certainly wasn't saying that I don't think that law and political economy shouldn't think about the true nature of value or where value resides. I actually think it's critically important that we have those conversations, but I don't think that a lot of law and political economy scholarship yet has returned to those debates in the way that classical political economy has or did. And I think one interesting thing, so I don't know if any of you are familiar with Mariana Mazzucato's book. So I kind of felt that she was promising maybe to do this. And I think it's a great book in many ways, and she sort of goes through this history of classical political economy and these different debates about value. But I think her main concern is to defeat this trend in financial capitalism. So she's very concerned with the turn things have taken towards value being, I can't call to mind the language that she uses, but she's very concerned about what's happened in financialized capitalism. And I think she ends up coming back to sort of rest without being very critical at all about certain patterns of value produced by labor exploitation. I mean, she then doesn't come back and problematize that whatsoever. And again, I think, not that I think it has to be about labor, but I think it probably needs to engage with the question of labor's role. And I think actually maybe that is the direction that the law and political economy movement most needs to go in thinking about how things are valued and maybe challenging that. So thanks.
Thank you for the questions and comments, Catalina, Antonio. Antonio, I agree with the crucial importance of enforceability, especially in countries, as you mentioned, in which this is really where this makes a lot of differences in Africa, as you said. And I think that perhaps enforceability is in the horizontal, but also in the vertical axis. It's in the horizontal, more formally speaking, because if you look at how effective a norm is, it can be something related to how enforceable it is. But it's not only about effectiveness; it has also something to do with the vertical axis, because respecting law or acting in accordance with law is also something related to the political environment in which you're living. So I agree with that, and I think that we have to refine things like that to capture that And I think that this is the task of legal sociologists for a long time. This is part of their agenda, looking at how people, to what extent people obey the law, to what extent people understand that law has consequences, and respect law, and on the other side of the coin, to what extent the state is capable of, without being authoritarian, making law as something enforceable. So just to agree with you, that's key, and that's part of the agenda, that's for sure. And Katarina, I just wanted to comment that if I didn't get your question or your comment wrong, I don't think that there is a distinction between structures and institutions in the sense that you that you have to choose between them, because as far as I understood, institutionalism, it's precisely the type of approach that tries to connect agency and structures, and I'm referring to something that Hodgson wrote when he was in a debate with the Marxists, and he said the feature of institutional thought is that it's able, I think he was, as you know, referring mostly to Veblen, but the feature is that institutional thinking is something that tries to manage with the fact that actions or agency are defined and shaped by structures, but structures can be also changed by agency, and that's what he calls enculturation, as I remember. So I understand what you said, but I don't think that it's a matter of choosing, or maybe, please correct me if I didn't understand what you said, but I think that thinking institutionally considers the whole big structures that influence behavior or agency, and at the end of the day, those structures are also institutions, right?
What is the purpose of introducing this term of institutional arrangements? Why are you trying to introduce that?
Okay, I was talking about institutional arrangements because, as I see them, institutional arrangements are less abstract to observe because they are there. They are things that structure policies. They connect actors, they connect agency within a structure of legal framing, and also in a realm of political power. So I think that looking at institutional arrangements, it's easier, pragmatically speaking, to look at institutions because, as Hodgson also says, institutions are everywhere, but they're invisible. So looking at something that you can see or perhaps touch or feel when you look at things is easier than simply looking at institutions as vague social constructions. That's why I was trying to move away from very difficult objects or subjects such as institutions in policies. I thought that institutional arrangements are more concrete. That's what I thought. That's what I came.
Okay, thank you, Jed, Anna, and Diogo. Thank you all. And this section is finished. Please, all speakers, wait here for the lunch. And then we're going to return at 2, okay? So, on a final word, I would like to thanks to CAPES, which is a federal agency that finance partially this event, and we also would like to thanks Dave, because Dave helped us to create the Trubex chair at FGV Law School, who partially financed this event as well. Okay, so see you too.